let's jump right into this, because we've got a truly fascinating analysis lined up today. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a recent, highly debated Sky News Australia broadcast that tackles two major cultural clashes dominating the Australian landscape right now. Now, on the surface, these two stories look completely unrelated, but as you'll see, the commentators draw a very distinct ideological line connecting them. We're talking about the shifting sands of media, politics, and honestly, what happens when powerful institutions collide with everyday public sentiment.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, debating Australian culture. Then, media exits and cancel culture, followed by reviving the voice debate, and finally, the blue-collar political warning. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Debating Australian culture.
So, how exactly are a morning TV host's exit from a major network and a trade union's massive political push connected? I know, it kind of sounds like the setup to a bizarre joke, right? But this question is actually the core thesis of the broadcast we're analyzing. The commentators make the case that both of these events are just symptoms of a much broader culture war, one where activist pressure is fundamentally rewiring how media and political groups operate.
Just a quick heads up before we really get into the weeds here, we are staying completely neutral. The source material dives into some highly charged political and cultural stuff. Our goal today isn't to take a side, but simply to impartially break down the specific arguments, theories, and perspectives that were aired by the commentators during the Sky News broadcast. We just want to understand how they are framing these debates.
Section 2. Media exits and cancel culture.
Okay, so this brings us to the first major case study from the broadcast. Picture this. On one side, you have the highly regulated, super advertiser-friendly world of corporate TV, specifically Karl Stefanovic's longtime gig on Channel 9's The Today Show, and on the other side, the absolute Wild West of unrestricted podcasting. Stefanovic recently launched a podcast and sat down with controversial figure Tommy Robinson. Well, according to the broadcast, Channel 9 management decided this crossed a major line, and it ultimately led to Stefanovic's exit from the network. It's basically a classic collision between old media boundaries and new media freedom.
Now, what's really crucial here is how the commentators frame this departure. One of them, Joe, absolutely doesn't see this as just your standard corporate HR move. No, he defines it strictly through the lens of cancel culture. And he describes the specific flavor of cancel culture as a situation where organizations are essentially bullied or kowtowed by activist groups who wave around the threat of advertiser boycotts. He really points to this dynamic as a pretty nasty side effect of the modern media landscape.
The panel then zeroes in on a really big question. Did Channel 9 jump the gun? Did they pull the cord too early? They frame this entire debate heavily around the concept of free speech. The commentators argue that, hey, Stefanovic was totally transparent with anyone who asked about his podcast guests, Tommy Robinson included. Their argument is essentially that since he was running a completely separate podcast, he should have been given the leeway to interview whoever he wanted without it blowing up his corporate TV career.
But right here is where the commentary takes a super fascinating twist. Because in a video posted just shortly after the news broke, Stefanovic explicitly said, quote, "I'm free. I'm finally free." The commentators immediately latched onto that specific phrasing, and they use it to present a really intriguing alternative theory about what was actually going on behind closed doors.
Ready for the theory? Commentator Joe hypothesizes that Stefanovic might have actually orchestrated his own cancellation. Yep, he suggests that Stefanovic was practically daring the network to sack him. Why? Well, according to the broadcaster, his heart just wasn't in the morning show anymore. He supposedly knew he might be out by the end of the year anyway. His real passion was this new podcast. Joe points out that Stefanovic is incredibly good at effortlessly generating attention and controversy, kind of implying he used that exact skill to force the network's hand so he could be set free to do what he actually wanted. Pretty wild, right?
Section 3. Reviving the voice debate.
Okay, we're pivoting now from the media battleground over to the political one, but we are absolutely keeping our focus on this theme of institutions versus the public. To understand this next segment, you really need to know about the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Now, what's key here is how the broadcast defines them. The commentators don't just see them as a standard worker advocacy group, far from it. Commentator Mia describes them as a massively funded powerhouse that wields so much influence over government decisions, they effectively act as another arm of government. That framing is absolutely vital for understanding the panel's frustration with the union's latest political strategy. And that strategy? It involves the Indigenous Voice to Parliament. The broadcast makes a point to highlight that leading up to the referendum, millions upon millions of dollars were thrown at the Yes campaign
by essentially every corporate entity in Australia, plus all the major union groups. They had this massive financial and institutional backing to pitch their case to the Australian public.
But despite all those millions spent, the Australian public definitively rejected the proposal in an absolute landslide. The referendum ended up with roughly a 60% no vote compared to a 40% yes vote. To put that into perspective, every single state in the country voted no. The public's voice on this specific constitutional change was, well, undeniably clear.
Which brings us to this pretty blunt quote from Mia on the panel: "Enough is enough is enough." Despite that super definitive democratic result, the broadcast points out that the peak union movement is now saying they don't accept the decision and they actually want to go back and do it all again. The commentators express this really deep brewing frustration that highly funded union groups are trying to force through ideas that the Australian public have literally just rejected at the ballot box. They're basically calling on the government to just shut the conversation down entirely.
To further prove that this debate hasn't actually gone away, the panel points directly to state-level politics. Specifically, they look at Victoria, where the state government has introduced a treaty process. The commentators describe this setup as basically establishing a third chamber of parliament, one inhabited solely by Indigenous representatives who are elected only by other Indigenous people. They use this as concrete evidence that the political fracture is still continuing, completely ignoring the national referendum's mandate.
Section 4. The blue-collar political warning.
Now, I want to add a really important layer of nuance here. Commentator Joe, he isn't approaching this from a strictly oppositional standpoint. He explicitly states in the broadcast that he actually supported and voted yes for the voice. He even prosecuted the case on Sky News, yet even as a supporter, he expresses absolute horror at how left-wing campaigns are handling the aftermath. His point is, if you're not going to respect the result of a referendum, then honestly, what is the point of even having one?
Joe saves his absolute harshest criticism for the ACTU's current strategy of trying to re-prosecute the case right now. He calls it, quote, "not just an act of self-harm, it is a death wish." He warns that pushing this issue right now, at a time when blue-collar workers are actively deserting the labor movement, is just pure political insanity.
Based on all this, Joe lays out a very systematic list of strategic warnings for the Australian Labor Party, the ALP. First up, he says they absolutely must demonstrate that they are the party of patriotism. Second, they need to completely stop any discussions about moving Australia Day away from January 26th. Third, they've got to move past these, in his words, stupid culture wars and obsessions with race. Because if they don't do these things, and instead they let unions keep pushing the voice, he warns they're going to watch their traditional blue-collar base desert them and run straight into the arms of right-wing populist parties like One Nation.
So what's the big takeaway tying this whole explainer together? It's this conclusion drawn by the commentators. Whether it's a TV network caving to the threat of activist boycotts, or political unions ignoring a massive, definitive democratic referendum, the panel views both of these as institutions severely misreading the general public. They argue that prioritizing activism over mainstream public opinion is an insanity that alienates everyday people and actively drives working-class voters straight to fringe parties.
Which leaves us with this final, pretty provocative thought to wrap up today. If our big media institutions and our political heavyweights increasingly cater to activist pressures and ideological extremes, what actually happens to the mainstream Australian voice? Do they just walk away? It's a fascinating question raised by this broadcast, and it's one that is absolutely going to shape the culture wars for years to come. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and keep learning.